Oh, this is really exciting. Lots of adventure and excitement awaits us, and we're just about to start, 1 minute away. I can get started right now just a little bit. My name is Susie Spickle, and I am the Community Programs Director here at the Harris Center in Hancock, New Hampshire. And if this is your first time seeing or being involved with the Harris Center, hello, we're so happy you're here. We're a small land trust in southwestern New Hampshire, and we like to say that we help people fall in love with the place that they're in, the Monadnock region, mostly right around here. But tonight we're spreading out our wings a little further. We help people do this in a couple of different ways. We do conservation research on our land. We have lots of protected land that people do research on and go hiking on and is protected for wildlife. And we also do a lot of education in 5 different school districts and programs like this, programs that range all the age span. I like to call it the lifespan. So you can find out a lot more about us on our website at www.harriscenter.org. The Harris Center. I'm so glad all of you are here, but I'm so excited to have our incredible guest tonight, Julia Saltzman, who is not that far away from us right now. She's at UNH. She is a marine conservation biologist whose research focuses on the effects of extreme events on sharks and rays. Wow. She graduated from the University of Miami in 2021 with her bachelor's degree in marine science, biology, and ecosystem science and policy. Julia, that's a lot. I can't believe you did all that. And she's now pursuing her PhD at the University of New Hampshire. Woo! She also works with the Terranaut Club, where she helps bring girls and underrepresented genders to the forefront of exciting hands-on, immersive experiences in science and nature. And that is really right up my alley. It's really such a joy for me tonight to turn this over to Julia.
So tonight I'm going to talk to you a little bit about sharks in general, sharks that live in New England. So let me just introduce myself first. So I'm originally from Cleveland, Ohio, and I graduated from the University of Miami, where I studied marine science, biology, and ecosystem science and policy. I was pretty set on just studying environmental science because I took AP environmental science back in high school and I loved it. And then I discovered marine biology. So I wasn't really the kind of person that like grew up on the ocean, always knew I wanted to study marine biology. I knew that I always liked the environment and being outside. And I had a lot of like different fun experiences doing outdoor things as a kid, but not really necessarily related to the ocean, being from Cleveland, Ohio. In undergrad, I started doing research in a lab studying plants. My work was looking at heat tolerance of tropical leaves, which is really different from sharks, but I learned the principles of research. And eventually that led me to work in 2 different shark research labs. Most recently, I worked with Dr. Catherine McDonald, who's a shark scientist in South Florida. She studies sharks and rays and other marine megafauna. And currently, I'm a graduate student at the University of New Hampshire in the quantitative marine ecology lab. So basically, what our lab does is we all have different interests. One of my lab mates is really into octopus. I'm really into sharks. And we apply different mathematical and quantitative tools to conservation. So basically that's what we do, and that's who I am. And these are just some pictures of me talking with little kids about sharks. That's something that I love to do. I work with Skype a Scientist. But this was back pre-COVID when we were allowed to go into classrooms, which was fun because I could bring in shark teeth and stuff. So currently, my research focuses on a couple different species of sharks. Actually, I'm not studying any that are in New England right now. Hope to soon, but I'm kind of just finishing up with my tropical stuff. But I worked previously with the small-toothed sawfish, which is actually a ray. They're critically endangered, and my work with them, basically, I use social media posts to track their habitat use and movement. And my master's and PhD research, in addition to having some New England stuff, probably still in the process of figuring it out. It's a little difficult with COVID to facilitate field work where you all have to be close together on a boat. is working with this really big 30-year data set from Costa Rica, studying the planktivorous elasmobranchs there. So that's the whale sharks and the manta rays. So specifically the sharks that eat plankton. So boring stuff about me. Now let's get into the fun stuff. We can talk about sharks. So today, first, we're going to talk about what is a shark, what sharks live in New England, how sharks are studied, and how we can conserve sharks. So moving into the first part of my presentation, Sharks 101. What is a shark? So first of all, sharks are fish. So they don't look a lot like the fish that you would go to a pet store and see, but they actually are fish. So within the fish, there are two different classes. There's the chondrichthyes and the osteolithes. Big words. So the cartilaginous fish, those are the elasmobranchs. So that's the sharks, the rays, the skates, and the chimeras. And then the osteolithes are the bony fishes. Those are the goldfish and like the fishy fish. So that's just a little bit of background. So sharks are fish. The biggest difference between the elasmobranchs, which are the sharks, the rays, and the skates, and the teleosts is that they are cartilaginous. So when I'm with kids, I like to tell them to touch their nose and touch their ears, and that's what sharks are made of. They have no bones. They have teeth that are made out of dentine, but they don't have any bones. So they're pretty bendy and flexible creatures. Whereas teleosts, so that's the goldfish, the catfish, they have bones. So if you're looking at a shark fin, these are dried shark fins. I know they look kind of like ruffles, like potato chips, but they're not. They're shark fins. And each one of these little lines is a fin ray. Those are called Ceratotrachea. And what those are is they're made out of cartilage. And when they're dried up, they can actually be dried and shredded into noodles. And those noodles are what's used in shark fin soup. They have no flavor. Typically, they're flavored with either chicken broth or some other kind of fish broth. But that's actually what makes up shark fin soup. So the Ceratotrachea. And this is what the bone of a fish looks like. So you can imagine that for like paleontologists, those are the people that study fossils. Cartilage doesn't preserve very well. So it's sometimes hard to look at like the historic records of sharks, but it's a lot easier to look at the historic records of fishes. Going back to the question of what makes a shark, they have something called celerial tooth production and replacement. So as humans, we have our baby teeth, we lose our baby teeth, and then we get our adult teeth, and that's it. We might get our wisdom teeth taken out, but like we're pretty much done with losing teeth once we're like, 10 years old. Throughout a shark's life, they will lose teeth, and they have basically an unlimited supply. So some species will shed up to 6,000 teeth in their lifetime. These teeth are made out of dentine. They do preserve better in the fossil record. So we can learn a lot about historic sharks from like back in the dinosaur times from their teeth. Sharks have 5 to 7 gills. Fish usually have 1 gill, like if we're talking about the bony fishes. So this is just what the shark gills look like. And sharks have something called dermal denticles. People often ask me, are sharks slimy? And the answer is no. Their skin actually feels like sandpaper. So this photo is a close-up of the skin on a nurse shark. But basically, dermal denticles are tiny placoid scales that it literally translates to skin teeth. So they're basically mini teeth, and that's what covers their entire body. This is advantageous for a couple of reasons. First, because the ocean's a pretty rough place. So it's sort of like an armor. It protects sharks from bigger sharks and from everything else in the ocean. And also it's incredibly hydrodynamic. So that means that when sharks are swimming through the water, denticles help to reduce drag. So an interesting fact about this is actually some Olympic swimmers have tried to base their swimsuits off of dermal denticles of incredibly fast sharks. And also these dermal denticles are naturally like antimicrobial. So they don't really grow a ton of harmful bacteria on them. So some surfaces in hospitals have been modeled after dermal denticles to try to prevent bacteria from growing on them. I like to point out that not all denticles are the same. Different species and different families of sharks have really different shaped denticles. And I have a good friend whose entire PhD is just going to be looking at the shapes of denticles. So they're all just completely different, and they change on different parts of their body, and they change as sharks age and enter different portions of their life. So talking a little bit about shark reproduction. So when fish have babies, they do something called broadcast spawning. That means that the male fish release a bunch of sperm and the female fish lay eggs, and they hope they meet. And if they don't, oh well, they release hundreds and hundreds of sperm and eggs. Sharks, on the other hand, all exhibit internal fertilization. That means that the male shark and the female shark have to meet for there to actually be a reproductive event. Some sharks, after this internal fertilization, will lay eggs. Some other sharks have eggs that grow inside of their belly and then hatch, and then they give birth to live young. It does depend upon the species. But the key thing to remember is that the male sharks and the female sharks actually have to find each other in the big giant ocean somehow to have this reproductive event. Sharks have no maternal care. So when they have their babies, it's like a mini fully working machine shark that can just go on its way and be a shark. And the babies usually swim away really fast to avoid getting eaten by their mothers. So sharks are incredibly diverse. They range from about the size of your palm. The smallest sharks discovered is the size of the palm of your hand, and that's the dwarf lantern shark. Dwarf ninja lantern shark, actually, I think is its name. To as big as of the size of a school bus, which is the whale shark. So they range, they have all different looks. They can look like a great hammerhead. They can look like the sharky sharks, like a great white. There's saw sharks, which actually have a saw protruding out of their head. So it's an incredibly diverse and highly evolved group. But as highly evolved as sharks are, 37% of sharks and rays, so rays are like the stingrays, they're close cousins of the sharks, are threatened with extinction. That means that they are they're in this category. They're either critically endangered, endangered, or vulnerable. This doesn't include the hundreds of species of sharks that are data deficient. So there's so many species of sharks, especially ones which live in the deep ocean, that we know literally nothing about. And scientists are discovering new species of sharks several times a year. So it's just important to note that in general, we don't know a ton about a lot of species of sharks. We're discovering new species all the time, and they're incredibly threatened. So moving on to sharks of New England. Does anyone have any questions? I can check in the chat.
Yes, there are some questions, Julia. One of them is, do some sharks not have any teeth at all?
So all sharks have teeth, even the planktivorous ones that are filter feeders, like the whale shark. They're just like really tiny teeth. Scientists, we don't really know why they have those really tiny ones. It's sort of like the same reason us people, like we have appendixes, but we don't really know why we have them. It's a vestigial organ. Yeah.
And okay, there was one last question, and you might get to this, but somebody's really interested in knowing, why are small tooth sawfish endangered?
Oh, that's a really good question.
Great.
So the reason that sawfish specifically are endangered is a couple different things. One, they have those really long rostrums that protrude off their head with it looks like a chainsaw. Those get stuck in fishing nets really easily. So they're frequently caught as bycatch. Historically, in the 1960s through the 1980s, those rostrums were actually used as like weapons, and they were kind of like ornamental. If you go to an antique shop, sometimes you can still find them. Right now they're regulated by CITES. So that means like I couldn't go find a sawfish and cut off its saw and sell it. But if they're an antique, they can still be sold. So sometimes if you're at an antique store and you see those like saws, those are rostrums from sawfish. They used to be found all the way from the Bahamas up through New York. And currently their documented range is only in Florida and the Bahamas. So yeah, that's why sawfish are endangered. I could get on a tangent about sawfish.
Well, I have two more questions. This one is cracking me up. It is from a middle school boy, as noted in the chat. Do sharks fart?
Oh, that's a good question. They do. So just like every other species, to my knowledge, they do. And I have been like working with sharks in the field and had them poop on me, but I don't know if they farted, but they do fart. Yeah, a lot of scientists actually do study waste and excretion of species because it gives you a really good idea of what they're eating. So some scientists recently figured out if they swab the cloaca on the shark, which is where the poop comes out of, they can do DNA analysis to figure out everything that shark has eaten in the past like month, which is crazy.
Wow,
So,
I love that. All right, and here's one last question before we move on to sharks of New England, and that is Madeline wants to know, how many rows of teeth do sharks typically have?
that depends upon the species. Like I know the great white has, I think, like 10, but they are always kind of like stacking up. So they continually have rows of teeth which are being replaced. So it depends upon the species and also what they like to eat. So for example, tiger sharks, their teeth are kind of like saws, because they like to eat turtles and they're really hard, versus hammerheads, which like to eat like stingrays and fish, which aren't super hard. Their teeth are more like pokey, like scalpels. So it depends upon what they like to eat.
All right, I think we're good. I will move
Okay,
on to
cool.
sharks of New England.
Okay, so Sharks of New England, they're Patriots fans. They like lobster, Dunkin' Donuts. So I talked a little bit before about the Iucn status. I'll go back to that slide. And I just wanted to point out what there's different statuses. So there's data deficient, least concern, near threatened, vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered. And then there's these extinct in the wild and extinct. So these are developed by the Iucn, which is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And basically scientists who study different species will classify species based upon what we know about them in one of these categories. So I have noted what the category is for these species, either in New England or in general, but it's just an important thing to know when we're talking about them. So first, we're going to talk about the blue shark, which is a beautiful animal. They're currently listed as near threatened. I personally have worked with the blue shark when I was fishing off of shoals, off the Isles of Shoals. This past summer, we were out, I was the teaching assistant for a shark conservation class out at Shoals Marine Lab, which is a really awesome class for college students. But we were lucky enough to encounter 3 blue sharks, and they're incredibly long, who is like the one thing that stuck out to me about them. And they actually are very bright blue. So blue sharks are known to be highly migratory. So what does this mean? This means that they go all over the place. They can be, this is the track from one shark over the course of a year, by OSearch. And basically this shark went all the way up from northern Florida up to Rhode Island, back down towards Bermuda, and then back up into Rhode Island, all over the course of 1 year. So they move all over the place. Basically, they make several trips throughout all of the ocean basins over the course of their lifetime. And what scientists believe happens is blue sharks have really big pectoral fins. Those are the ones that kind of look like this. And because they're so big, what the scientists believe is that blue sharks can actually like ride through the currents much easier than some other species. And that's how they're able to conserve energy and be so migratory. And for most of the year, males and females live completely separately. And then at one point throughout the year in a couple of different locations, they come together very briefly to reproduce through internal fertilization. Because blue sharks are listed by the IUCN as near threatened, they're not endangered. Typically, they're not, for some reason, picked by scientists often to be a study species because their conservation might not necessarily be a huge priority. However, they are caught very frequently by recreational fishermen, particularly anglers off the coast of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Maine. And what we do know is that compared to some other species, blue sharks are relatively hardy. That means that they aren't super susceptible to capture stress as much as some other species, such as the great hammerhead is. So that means that if a recreational angler or a commercial fisherman were to accidentally or on purpose catch a blue shark, there's a very high chance that that shark would survive versus some other species, such as the great hammerhead. Post-release mortality from commercial fishing vessels and from recreational fishermen is upwards of like 75%. So they're a pretty hardy species and they're relatively common. I can anecdotally tell you that at the Isles of Shoals at Shoals Marine Lab off of UNH, at UNH, there were 2 courses. They each had like 3 fishing days each this summer, and we caught 20 subadult male blue sharks and 1 female that was sexually mature. So we don't really know why that happened, but it's an interesting pattern and something that definitely needs to be looked at more. This is the spiny dogfish. They're currently listed as vulnerable. This species is really important from a fisheries perspective. So the spiny dogfish fishery operates from Maine to Florida, inshore and offshore on the edges of the continental shelf. And this fishery uses predominantly bottom gill nets and trawls. But interestingly, there's really not that much of a demand for spiny dogfish meat in the United States. The strong majority of it is actually exported to Europe, and it's used as fish and chips. So if you hear people in Europe and people in South Africa talking about eating fish and chips, this is almost all of the time dogfish meat. And commercial landings for the spiny dogfish totaled more than 16.7 million pounds, and it was valued at $3.7 million. So it's a pretty valuable fishery, despite the fact that it's really not a desired meat in the United States. And a lot of commercial fishermen who are in the groundfish fishery see dogfish as a bit of a nuisance. Like, they don't really like it when they hit a patch of dogfish and they're not super excited about it, but their meat can be exported. The thing with dogfish in their fishery is they're a schooling species. So if you're a fisherman and you're out fishing for groundfish and you catch 1 spiny dogfish, you're going to start catching more and you'll end up with like hundreds of dogfish on a day. So it does kind of make sense why they're considered a bit of a nuisance. But the interesting thing about spiny dogfish reproduction is the females are pregnant for 18 to 24 months. So almost 2 years they can be pregnant. And they grow incredibly slowly. So they mature late in life at between the ages of 20 and 25. And the females live up to 40 years. So the females are actually able to reproduce at age 12, and they live up to 40 years, sorry. So the interesting thing about this is that scientists have projected that because dogfish were overfished in the 1990s and early 2000s, we're just now going to see the effects of that on the population level because that group was overfished. So this is a spiny dogfish pup, and this is a nourishment sac. This basically, so when a human is pregnant, they have an umbilical cord, and whatever the mother eats, the baby eats basically through the umbilical cord. That's how they get their nourishment. The spiny dogfish will have several of these pups, up to 12, between 2 and 12 in their stomachs, and they have this sac of basically, it's called intrauterine milk, that they have throughout the pregnancy, and it's like closed. So that amount of milk supports the pup throughout its whole pregnancy. I say this because spiny dogfish are frequently used for dissections in physiology and anatomy labs in the high school classroom. So if any of you have dissected a dogfish before, you might happen to stumble upon a pregnant one. So that's where the rest of the dogfish that aren't sent out to the UK, which are caught, go. They actually go to classrooms to be dissected. So introducing you guys to the basking shark. They are an endangered species which are found in New England. An interesting fact about the basking shark is that many tales of serpents and sea monsters that fishermen used to tell actually originated from sightings of basking sharks cruising in single file lines near the surface of the water. So not serpents and not sea monsters, just these really big, harmless planktivorous sharks. So basking sharks get their name from what they're doing in this photo, which is basking in the sun. They are the second largest fish in the world, and they can weigh upwards of 5 tons. And basically, they're often seen cruising near the surface, which is where the name basking comes from. So the basking shark is one of 3 other large filter feeding sharks. The other species of filter feeding sharks are the whale shark, which is the largest fish in the world, and the megamouth shark. And what they do is they feed on zooplankton. So they're really, really big, kind of intimidating animals, but they eat some of the smallest creatures in the sea, which is pretty crazy, just like how sperm whales take in tons and tons of water and then filter out the plankton. So this is a photo of what zooplankton look like. So a characteristic feature of the basking shark is the juveniles have this long hooked like snout. And what we think that this is from, what scientists think, is that the snout is useful when they're feeding in the womb and when they're babies and they can't gulp in a ton of water, it helps to like hook in water. But as they age, they basically grow out of this. So similar to how human babies, their skulls like fuse together when they grow up, basking sharks actually grow out of this morphological feature, and the shape of their mouth changes in shape pretty rapidly relative to their length during their first year. So this is a photo of a neonate, so a very little basking shark. So there are a lot of threats to basking sharks. In the past, basking sharks were hunted worldwide for their oil, their meat, and their fins, and their vitamin-rich livers. So going back to when I talked a little bit about sharks versus fish, sharks have incredibly large oily livers, and that's how they're able to float in the water and not sink. Fish, on the other hand, have a swim bladder, and that's how they're able to float in the water and not sink. But this oily liver is full of this compound called squalene, which is a common ingredient in a lot of health foods. It's also an ingredient in cosmetics and in some vaccines. So it's not in the most recent COVID vaccines, the Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, or Moderna. However, if any of you have heard of Novavax, which is a vaccine which I believe was used in Canada, and some other vaccines which have been used internationally, squalene, which is derived from sharks' livers, is actually an ingredient and a key additive in those vaccines. Not to say that you shouldn't get vaccinated. You absolutely should get vaccinated, in my opinion, as a scientist. But the biggest issue here is not that us humans can't create squalene, because we can. It's actually a byproduct, a slightly different thing from squalene. It's called squalane, so it has an A instead of an E. But it's essentially the exact same thing, is a byproduct from the production of sugar. But because squalene is approved by federal drug agencies, but squalane is not, despite the fact that it does the exact same thing, we keep pivoting back to these shark-derived products. So basically, the moral of this story is that sharks are an ingredient in more things that you think they are. And like a simple change on the part of like a drug administration company and changing one ingredient would cost millions of dollars, and it would lead to delays in the production of the vaccines. So that's why the squalene was used in some forms of the COVID vaccine. But what scientists did find is that the amount of vaccines that were produced with it had virtually no ramifications on shark populations, because they were using products which were already harvested. So back to the basking shark. Today, the fishing for basking sharks has ceased, except for in China and Japan, where their fins are sold as a key ingredient in shark fin soup. And a fresh pair of wet basking shark fins can fetch up to $1,000 in fish markets. Basking sharks are pretty hard to catch. They're planktivores, so like they're not going to catch a hook with a chunk of bait on it. So they're caught with either nets or with like spear guns. So they're a pretty difficult species to catch. They're not really fished for here in New England. They could potentially get tangled up in fishing nets, which is always a risk for any marine species, whether it be a basking shark, a turtle, or a seal. But the biggest threat to basking sharks right now is boat strikes. So in New England, in Australia, they're very susceptible to be struck by boat motors. You probably have heard about this problem a lot with manatees getting struck by boats. Very, very similar. But the thing is, manatees don't have fins, so they can often recover from a deep gash, but the basking sharks tend to get their fins caught in props of boats. So their fate isn't usually as positive as a manatee who's struck by a boat. And they're also caught in bycatch, as I said before. So that's a little bit on the basking sharks. Now we'll move to the thresher sharks. There's 3 species of threshers, 2 of which are found in New England waters, the common thresher shark and the big-eyed thresher shark. These illustrations are by Kelly Quinn. She's a scientific illustrator. Her work is really incredible. If you're interested in like shark posters and stuff, I definitely would recommend her work. But basically, the pelagic thresher, which is a species down here, is not found in New England waters. It's found off of California and Mexico. But it's important to note that we think it's not found in New England waters. The distribution data is imprecise because it's often confused with the common thresher, and the pelagic thresher may occur in a wider area presently than what is actually known. So we think these are the 2 that are here, but the case of mistaken identity is kind of making it a little unclear. So the common thresher is currently listed as vulnerable by the IUCN. The common thresher is easily recognized by their upper caudal lobes. That's the super duper long tail I'll show you in the next picture, which basically what they do with this long tail is they use it to swat at their prey. They will literally stun a fish with their tail and then eat it, which is really crazy. And they also are incredibly fast swimmers, which will sometimes breach out of the water to also stun their prey. The big eye thresher has a similar foraging strategy. It also will use that tail to slap and stun their prey. The common thresher shark has a similar appearance to the big-eyed thresher, but it can be distinguished by the coloration. So it's a little bit bluer, and the size of its eye. So The big eye thresher gets its name from these giant eyes that they have, which are evolutionarily advantageous because they're highly adapted for seeing in low light. So they like to hunt in the dark. The big eye thresher practices something called diel vertical migration. That means it spends the day in the cool, deep waters, and then at night, it follows zooplankton, which are followed by fish and followed by squid, which come to the surface at night. So it hunts predominantly at night, and they eat small fish and squid, which they stun with this giant long tail. All right, so talking a little bit about the great white shark, which is currently listed as vulnerable. Great white sharks, the largest, weighed upwards of 5,000 pounds, and are reportedly can exceed 21 feet. That's not really how big they are in New England. But those are like the biggest ones that have ever been found. As they mature, newborn great whites feed on little fishes, and then as they get older, their prey pivots and includes sea turtles, seals, sea lions, porpoises, dolphins, and small whales. But they're opportunistic scavengers. So that means that they'll feed on pretty much anything, including whale carcasses and carcasses of even larger sharks like basking sharks. So I'm sure all of you have heard of the movie of Jaws, which featured a great white, which attacked people. But basically, I wanted to tell you guys a little bit about something called the Jaws effect, which is a result of the movie Jaws and the book Jaws. But it's basically, there's 3 tenets to it, and it's the belief that sharks intentionally bite humans, that when a human encounters sharks, it will pretty much always be fatal, and that sharks should be killed to prevent future attacks. So obviously, not all true things at all. Human shark interactions occur, but in general, sharks do not pose a threat to people. And I can make a list of the things that are more likely to hurt you, even if you're a surfer. And that's vending machines, driving a car, getting on an airplane. All of those things are far more risky than getting in the water. But basically, this Jaws effect was perpetuated by the movie, per no fault of the authors or Steven Spielberg. And they've actually tried to counter it by supporting shark conservation in a lot of ways. But following Jaws, people went out to fish for sharks, and shark trophy fishing became extremely popular because people thought that killing great whites would save beachgoers, and killing any shark would save beachgoers. But basically, the Jaws effect ultimately was the basis for the sanctioned killing of sharks in the United States, in Australia, in countries across the world, by saying that it would provide beach safety, when in reality, killing sharks that are out far into the ocean does not protect beaches at all. And typically, we can talk a lot about how highly evolved sharks are and how incredible their senses are. The cases where sharks do bite people are one of 2 things. One, it's a case of mistaken identity, which I'm sure most of you have heard of, where the shark assumes that a surfer is a seal. But more likely than that, what a lot of scientists believe occurs is sharks don't have hands. And great whites in particular are super sophisticated, even social animals. And they want to see what's in their environment, and they don't have hands. So they're like babies. They're like, oh, I'll just put this thing in my mouth. But like a great white can't just like suck on a lollipop the way a baby would bite something, right? Like it's not like that. So it's typically them trying to figure out what you are. But the problem with that is like, oh, it's a great white shark. Even if it takes a tiny nibble, it's going to be highly impactful to people. So that's basically the basis of the Jaws effect and the ideology behind that. But the basic premise is that behind like the idea of shark attacks is that really they're not often attacks. Typically they're cases of curiosity or mistaken identity. And we know this because great whites can eat a seal in like 3 bites. So if they wanted to consume a person, they would, but they're not really ever consuming people. They're typically taking a nibble, which is an impactful nibble, but they're not eating people. And there have been repeated studies on the part of scientists with smaller species of sharks where they actually put blood in the water from fish, from humans, and from mammals to see what attracts sharks. And typically they're only attracted to the fish and sometimes to the mammals, hardly ever to the people. It doesn't elicit a response on their part. And the thing that actually attracts sharks isn't blood in the water. It's actually a hormone which is released by injured fish. So if a fish has an injury, it releases something called alarm cue. It's a hormonal response to alert other fish in the school that something has happened. And that's actually what sharks are smelling, not necessarily blood in the water. So you may hear that like a shark can smell a drop of blood from a mile away. That's false. They do have an incredible sense of smell, but not that good. So moving on a little bit from that, do white sharks have friends? I often get asked, like, do sharks have friends? And the answer is we think that white sharks actually might have friends. Little is known about the social behavior and natural history of the white shark. But there's some evidence that some sharks may be territorial and assume dominance around specific feeding areas. And while most white sharks are largely solitary, there have been some that have been seen migrating together over long distances in pairs and associating with one another over large periods of time. And some individuals will reside in one area throughout the whole year. So they might live in South Africa or live in the Cape all year. But other individuals will actually migrate massive distances. So they can be residential and they can be travelers. So talking a little bit about white sharks in New England. So in the North Atlantic, Cape Cod is the largest aggregation site for white sharks. If you're interested in the work being done on the Cape, I would definitely recommend looking at Atlantic White Shark Conservancy. They do a lot of really interesting work there, and they work with the Massachusetts government to promote beach safety, but also promote research. But basically, there's enormous scientific interest and public interest in white sharks. I did some work last year looking at what species of sharks are featured in Shark Week in representation of scientists in Shark Week. And obviously the most common featured shark in Shark Week is the great white, but we really still don't know a ton about them. But Cape Cod has become this really big aggregation site, and it's presented a really cool research opportunity. So this study from March of 2021 analyzed tag data from around 230 tagged white sharks since 2009. And what they found is that during these residency periods when sharks are on the Cape, individuals spend almost half of their time in depths of less than 4.5 meters, so pretty shallow waters. But they did make frequent excursions to mid-shelf depths in offshore waters, probably to hunt for fish. So they're hunting for seals in the shallow waters and fish in the deep waters. And they also found something really cool, which is that sharks were more likely to occupy shallow depths during the night and during new moons. So there is an influence of lunar cycle on shark behavior. So I think that's super crazy and really interesting. And this is consistent with past studies that suggest that sharks forage based on lunar cycles, consistent with studies at Seal Island in South Africa, which found that sharks have more frequency of kills, of attempts of killing seals, and more success at actually having a predation event during new moons and full moons. But basically what this study found overall is that the risk posed to humans by white shark is low, but there is a pretty high potential for overlap between white sharks and recreational water users off Cape Cod. But the risk of interaction is higher at dusk, so when it's dark, and during these new and full moons, and environmental conditions where it's easier for these species to be stealthy. So when the visibility is poor, when it's dark out, when they can more easily hunt. So basically all this information can be used to help promote beach safety. So talking a little bit about threats to white sharks, because white sharks are distributed throughout the world's oceans, comprehensive population surveys are pretty difficult, but catch rate data collected by fisheries officials and compiled suggests that they're undergoing population decline, but they've only been assessed in select regions, not including New England. So there hasn't been a full population assessment here. But it is considered critically endangered in the one region where there was an assessment, which is the Mediterranean Sea. So talking a little bit about the short fin Mako shark, which is also found in New England and is currently listed as endangered. The short fin Mako is considered the fastest shark in the world and can reach burst swimming speeds of up to 43 miles per hour. I know that might not seem super fast because like you're cruising down the road going 40 miles an hour, but if something struck you going 43 miles per hour, you can imagine that that would be a pretty big blow to you. Why are Makos so fast? The reason that Makos are so fast is because they're incredibly hydrodynamic and they basically are shaped like a torpedo. So they have a triangular snout and a large crescent-shaped caudal fin. So essentially they're just like a torpedo in the water, and that allows them to be incredibly hydrodynamic. Makos are highly susceptible to shark finning, to fishing, and to bycatch, and there is a Mako shark fishery. They are allowed to be caught. So aside from those main species that I talked about, there are some other species which are found in New England waters. That includes the poor Beagle shark. I like to call it the not so great white shark because it looks like a great white, but it's just kind of like a mini great white. Basically, evolutionarily, it is literally a mini great white. They are incredibly fast. They're in the same family. The interesting thing about the great white, the Mako, the basking shark, and the thresher is that they're all lamniforms. That means that they're actually warm-blooded species. So that's how they're able to live in these really cold waters. Whereas the tiger shark, which has been found in New England waters, and the smooth hammerhead, which has been found in New England waters, are not warm-blooded, and the cold water is just not great for them here. So they'll only come here when it's like really warm out. Basically like how Floridians will travel up north when it's warm. They like to spend their winters in the warm water and their summers in the cool water. So that's basically it about sharks from New England. Does anyone have any questions about that specifically before I move on to shark research and how sharks are studied, which will be pretty quick?
So Julia, there were a lot of questions. I'm going to just ask a few of them. So I want to make sure you get through your presentation, and then I'll save it if we have time at the end. But I'll ask some of the questions. And one of them was, are bull sharks really responsible for most attacks on people? And maybe one of the reasons is they can live and hunt in brackish or fresh water.
Yeah, so bull sharks are responsible for a decent amount of encounters with humans, but they are not the only species that can live in fresh water and brackish water. They just are commonly featured that way. But similarly to the great white, their hunting strategy brings them closer to people. Whereas with like a blue shark or a thresher shark, they hunt in the deep ocean where there aren't people swimming. So it really isn't necessary. Like you might hear that bull sharks are the most aggressive because they have the highest levels of testosterone. That's false. They just have the most encounters with people because they're coastal species. But yes, they can live in fresh waters, and they're one of many species of sharks and rays which can't live in fresh water.
Wow, that was really interesting. There are so many great questions. I'll do two more, and then we'll save the rest, and hopefully we'll get to most of them. The people want to know about how you would identify individual sharks during the studies that you're doing, because I think at the beginning you were talking about the blue sharks and you could identify different individuals.
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways we can do that, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit in the research section.
Okay. With
the great whites and with it's typically they're tagged with like an external tag, so you can see the tag that's on them. There's other ways that we can do that with like really large sharks, like whale sharks. You can identify them based upon the patterns of their skin. Great whites can be identified by scars that they have and by the shapes of their dorsal fins, which are like fingerprints. And And also with smaller sharks, a common method is actually something called a pit tag, which if you have a dog who's microchipped, it's the exact same thing as that. So in the Bahamas, where there's residential lemon sharks, every baby lemon shark gets a pit tag, and they can scan them when they come through the waters, and they just like hover a little scanner over and they can see which shark it was, which is really crazy.
That's really cool. Okay, this will be the last one, and then we'll wait for shark. We'll wait for you to wrap up. But out of the New England sharks, can you tell us which ones give live birth versus which one lay eggs in the egg cases?
All of the ones which I talked about give live birth. There are several species of skate, like I think the clear nose skate, which lay eggs. So if you find those like mermaids purses on the beach, those are from skates typically.
All right, thank you. And I'm sorry if you didn't get to I didn't get to ask your question, but I just want to make sure we get through some shark research and shark conservation. So maybe we'll just go through shark research and the last part, and then we'll save the questions until the end.
Yeah.
Does that sound good? Okay.
Yeah,
all right. Fascinating.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about different ways we can study sharks. One of the ways we can study sharks is by catching them and taking a small blood sample to study their physiology. Same way, if you go to the doctor's office, you can get your blood drawn and we can look at different nutritional markers. This is me performing a small blood draw on a bonnethead shark. From this, we can look at their sexual maturity, their testosterone levels, their estrogen levels. For people, if there's like these machines that you can just put a drop of blood in and it will tell you the ratio between your red blood cells and your white blood cells. We don't have that for sharks yet. So what scientists are trying to do is develop a standard for that. So that's why we were creating these blood smears in this photo on the corner, to allow us to actually count by hand the cells and the ratios of cells in their red and white blood cells. The blood draws can be taken from a number of places. We like to do it under their tail because it's just the most simple. Another way to study sharks is to study their movement. So there's a couple of different types of tags that you can put into sharks to look at where they're moving and how they're moving. The first is acoustic telemetry. So basically an internal tag is implanted into the sharks, and then whenever it swims by one of these receivers, the receiver picks up on that sound. The shark has to swim by the receiver for it to ping. So this is good for if we want to see what great whites are doing around Cape Cod, because we can have 50 receivers around Cape Cod and look at their fine scale movements. But this isn't the best for looking at long-term migrations. The other potential issue with this is the sharks have to swim by the receivers. So if they like go somewhere else, you can't do anything about it. The other thing that I've seen happen is some sharks that are pretty lazy will just lay in front of a receiver all day, and then it'll just ping constantly on the receiver for hours and hours and hours, and that just completely messes up scientists' data. The other option is satellite telemetry. That's these tags. So whenever the shark reaches the surface, it pings to a satellite. These are really awesome methods, but each one of these tags is about $3,500. And you need several hundred of these tags, or 50 to several hundred of these tags to be deployed to get an actual study on where sharks are moving and like their residency and where they like to spend time to help establish protected areas. So whereas these acoustic tags are $300 a piece, these ones are $3,000 a piece. So it's a bit of a trade-off. If you're interested in tracking sharks, I would recommend going to OSearch. You can track sharks and seals and sea turtles on their website. A method that I use a lot is underwater cameras to survey populations of sharks. This camera is called a BRUV, a baited remote underwater video. So basically it's a GoPro, PVC pipe, and bait in a crate, and we can count how many sharks swim by. So it's basically the same as if you're going into the woods and counting caterpillars. So it gives us a rough estimate of the diversity for those areas. All the scientists that use these BRUVs have come together to create something called global fin print, which has allowed us to get a global assessment of sharks, which is really, really interesting. And what they found is that sharks populations are declining heavily on the majority of coral reefs. Another way we can study sharks is with drones. Drones can be used to count how many sharks are in the area, but more often than not, they're used to study shark behavior. So this is from a scientist who actually studies great hammerheads feeding on blacktip sharks and the predation events between the two species. So they're commonly used to study behavior. Another way we can study sharks is with environmental DNA. And this is simply taking a water sample, sending it off, and it can be analyzed and tell you what species were in that water over the course of like 48 hours because you leave tiny pieces of DNA places. This is an emerging technology, and the biggest issue with this is that not every species has been sequenced yet, and it's also incredibly expensive. But as this becomes more mainstream, we'll be able to see a ton of really interesting information about sharks in all different species. I personally use social media to study movements of critically endangered species, as I referenced before. This is the small-toothed sawfish. And I was able to basically use Instagram posts to examine the abundance and diversity of different life stages of sawfish. And also, citizen science basically allows people to report whenever they encounter an animal. So talking a little bit about shark conservation and how you guys can help to conserve sharks. The first thing is doing exactly what you're doing today, and that's education, learning about sharks, learning about how to conserve them, and also teaching others, particularly younger students, but also education in that if you're a student and you're in high school studying math and science to ultimately become an environmental scientist or a marine biologist to help to promote conservation. The second big thing that you can do is make sustainable seafood choices. I typically point people to the Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch, and that basically allows you to enter in your location and tell them what seafood you want to eat, and it will tell you the sustainability of those different catches. And I also would encourage you to look at where your seafood comes from. Are you buying farmed salmon? Are you buying wild caught salmon? And look up how that potentially could impact sharks and all different other species around you. And also utilize your local fishermen. If it's a small scale fisherman who's going and catching 10 fish a day and selling them at a fish market, that's much more sustainable than supporting a commercial fisherman. If you like to fish for sharks and you go out recreational fishing for them, practice shark smart recreational fishing. So use whatever gear is recommended to you by your local government. That typically is circle hooks. Avoid a prolonged fight time. Don't just fight a shark for the thrill of it because they get really stressed out and sometimes they will die just from the fight on the line. Follow your local rules and guidelines and work with scientists. If you're going out and fishing for sharks, reach out to your local shark scientists and see if they want to come out on the water with you to deploy their tags. Why not kill two birds with one stone per se? And also citizen science. This is not necessarily just for sharks, but iNaturalist allows you to take a picture of a species if you see them on an app, and then it collects it into a database, and scientists can access this data. So this can be used for sharks. I know this has been used to actually track the distribution of those murder hornets and of invasive plant species. So anything you see, if you don't know what it is or you just want to see what it is, the iNaturalist app is great. For New England specifically, the Shark Spotter app run by Atlantic White Shark Conservancy is a really great tool because it tells you what sharks are actively pinging your different beaches, but you can also report if you see a shark. And if you are out fishing, see if you can join the NOAA shark tagging program and have tags on your boat so that if you were to catch a shark, you can tag it and help to support science. Also advocate, so talk with your local representatives about legislation related to seafood and sharks. Advocate for conservation-minded coastal development. So if a hotel is being on the coastline, how can we avoid destroying that coastal environment for that hotel to be built? And promote behavioral shifts. This means if you're on the beach and someone's leaving trash on the beach, say, hey, can you pick up that trash? Those small things make a really big impact in the long term. And remember that anything that conserves the ocean is shark conservation. So avoiding single-use bags, recycling, carpooling, anything that helps the environment helps sharks. And finally, supporting research. You can encourage students to participate in STEM activities to become research in the futures. You can support your local scientists, which is exactly what you guys are doing tonight, and attend talks like these, and support different research organizations. All of these are fabulous organizations. If you want to learn about how you can help advocate for sharks, I'd recommend Shark Allies. If you want to track sharks at all different times of the day, you can look at the OCEARCH Shark Tracker. For looking at Cape Cod safety specifically and everything around New England, I would recommend looking at Atlantic White Shark. And UNH is where I go. You can always email me if you have any questions. And I just want to thank all of these different organizations, especially the Harris Center. And a lot of this information came from the IUCN Red List and the Florida Museum of Natural History. And wouldn't be possible without my collaborators at Field School. So thank you to them as well. And I can take any questions if we want to take a couple minutes to answer questions. I'm happy to stick around.
Sure. Thank you so much, Julia. That was really fabulous. And you just know so much and you gave us so much information, especially loved all the ways that you said we could be involved. So all for it. And for those of you that are curious, we'll be sending this out as a recorded session so you can listen to it again. And in the email where you receive the recorded session, we'll put in links to the places that Julia highly recommended as well. So you can do your own research. There are just a few questions. This one has come up twice. And Julia just put her email in the chat so you can get that. But Julia, we do have some younger people in our audience, but people are curious about if sharks pee. And I think you can tell us a unique thing about sharks and peeing.
They do. And their cloaca is like their waste excretion hole, basically. And it's the same hole for poop and for pee, which is pretty interesting. And it's also for reproduction. So yes, sharks do pee. And so saltwater fish drink a lot of salt water and then they excrete a ton of salt, but sharks don't actually drink a ton of water as much as a fish would pee. So.
Great. All right, I'll give just two more questions and then we'll let everybody can do their own research or reach out to you. But this was an interesting question about related to the moon, the lunar cycle and sharks hunting. This is from Emily, and she wondered if the success of sharks hunting during new and full moons has to do with the high tide and the difference in the tide, if that's one of the theories that's out there.
It definitely is. One of the theories that's out there. Basically, so for me, I'm looking at that right now related to some other species of sharks, and the code that I'm using, which like integrates lunar cycle information, also integrates all of the tide information. And basically what we're seeing is they're like completely uniform, obviously. So yes, it's because of high tide. It also could potentially be because of illumination. So like how illuminated the moon is. And just like a behavioral thing, like they say weird things happen when like the moon is full, and we see that with a lot of species of fish. So like fish like to spawn when there's full moons and new moons, so it potentially could be because of that as well.
That's great. Okay, and we'll just end with this one. This is a great question I was curious about too. Can you identify a shark by its tooth if you find it on the beach? Like, can you look at the tooth and know what type of shark it came from?
You definitely can. I'm okay at it. There's like, it would definitely be a question you want to reach out to a paleontologist about, but the Florida Museum has like a shark tooth database, and you can kind of compare them. So if you like Google shark tooth guide, you can identify species. In New England, you'll probably find a lot of extinct sharks, the teeth from extinct sharks, which is really interesting. But I know in New Jersey, there's like this inland lake that is known to where you can find megalodon teeth. So it's not too far from here. I've been wanting to go there, but yeah.
Field trip. Next time we do this, let's go on a field trip. Thank you, Julia. That was absolutely awesome. You did a fabulous job. If you were at the Harris Center, we'd give you a standing O because you were just top notch. And it's so exciting to have someone like you with all your energy and just your focus and passion being involved in studying such an amazing creature, such amazing creatures as sharks. Really appreciate it and look forward to following your career and reading about you in places like the Smithsonian or Shark Week. Who knows what's next?
You. And if any of the like younger students in the classroom feel free to pass on my email to your teachers if you want to set up a classroom Zoom.
Oh, wow.
Or student kid related activity type
Oh
thing.
my gosh, Skype a scientist. That's so fabulous. I want to thank everybody for showing up. Julia's 100% right. One of the best ways that we can help this world is to educate ourselves and then share the information we have with the people around us. And Julia, you gave us so much. So thank you and good night to everybody. Really appreciate it. Julia, thumbs up.
Thank you.
Night, everybody. Bye.